introduction, I'm Kat Gaines. I was informed to check in that I'm the resident mermaid of today, so here. So I'll accept that. I lead developer. I wrote on here, I promised I'll post something eventually because until this morning that was like just an empty profile that I never ago and forgot about. I did post something this morning, so maybe there'll be a little bit more there soon. Also, that QR code is my LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me and find me there. So I remember my mom a few years ago texting me about a Facebook outage in October 2021. I don't know if anyone else has moms who just assume that anytime anything goes wrong with any of their technology, they turn to you first. But you know, contrary to her opinion, I don't actually know how to fix everything in the world and on the internet. That is not actually my life. So that's typical for her. I don't work for Facebook though. Even if I did, that was kind of a big deal. It wouldn't really have been a one-person thing. It wasn't just limited to her. And they posted this explanation later, which was a pretty long one. And for a lot of us, we'll read that and we'll think, okay, yeah, fine. I get the general gist of what's happening here. Must be hard, feel bad for them. But my mom is a little old German lady in her 70s. So for her, this is not like user-friendly messaging. I've worked for PagerDuty for 10 years. It took her about 8 of those to really kind of understand what I actually do for work. And I'm still not really convinced that she does. So this message, she didn't even know that there were things like status pages and engineering blogs that she could check. And even if she did, she's just not gonna get it. I wanna give the team managing this incident credit because it was a pretty gnarly one. They did later post a lengthier explanation the next day. They tried to break down the concepts a little bit further. It was an explanation that still might have gone a little bit over the heads of people who aren't in tech, but it was just an attempt to really relay how their app relates to the piece of their infrastructure that broke, so it was a step in the right direction. And again, my point isn't to shame anybody, but just to kind of highlight opportunity. You have to know who your customer is. You have to be able to speak the same language as them, especially when you're writing things like a status page update. I don't have insight into how the communications decisions happened in this moment, but we all know how it goes. It's chaos. You're just like, yeah, put something out there and make sure it makes sense to you. You may not actually double check that it makes sense to everyone who is going to be reading it. So if you potentially have someone advocating for your customers in that moment, and your customer's understanding of the issue, that can have a little more say in the messaging. That can really go a long way. A lot of us do work, in software and who understand that could use Facebook, but a lot of boomer moms. And so again, the point isn't to shame. We all make mistakes and we'll keep making mistakes periodically. That's just a given. But we can learn the importance of just involving your customer-facing teams in communications when something is going down. All right. There we go. So there is a really, really big gap between how your customers perceive your product, how your engineering and product teams perceive it. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to set aside best practices that we all may know and preach about. Even if you're following those to the letter, this gap is going to exist. Those groups are inevitably going to refer to the same things in completely different ways. The person sitting next to you might even just refer to a thing in a different way than you would. And let's not even talk about what happens when we throw, for example, marketing in there. I fall under the marketing org technically, so that's a self-dig. But this is PagerDuty's chart of basic incident roles in incident response. We're focusing here on those liaison roles that say internal liaison and customer liaison in orange for this talk. It's just good to remember where they sit in the overall context and process. So for the folks who can fill this role, you can think about your customer support team may have a unique advantage here. When I first gave this talk, it was coming from my background of until about 4 years ago or so, working in customer and technical support my entire career and seeing the other side of it. It was at a support-focused conference and I realized there was an angle for folks in this room too. They work with your customers every single day. They're the best position to understand what they're going through, how they think about things, how they talk about them. They've also seen it all. They've made mistakes. They've course corrected. They found the right ways to communicate with them. Every problem is really unique, but especially those more seasoned team members are going to have found a common language to speak to most of them and get the message across for how you talk about things internally. So before we dive deeper, we can just overview a little bit about how liaisons function in an incident. The communications liaison is really the link to your customers and stakeholders throughout the incident. It's important that the rest of the incident command staff can focus on the problem at hand, rather than worrying about how you craft a message to customers. You should have a say in it. It can be really an all-in-one type role, or it's sometimes broken out into just two separate roles, one for customers and one for internal stakeholders. So we can look at how both work. A customer liaison is the primary individual. They're in charge of notifying your customers of current conditions, informing the incident commander of any feedback that's coming in from customers during the incident itself, and they should be listening to the call. Maybe they're watching an incident Slack room or something similar to keep track of what's going on. They should be tracking incoming requests to understand the impact that the incident is having, bring that back into the call. So this is why it's really useful to have that person already be part of the support team. It's also worth noting that these are the folks that are carefully crafting messaging to your customers all of the time. For example, you don't want someone who isn't kind of trained in that to report maybe an outage when it's just an incident to a customer. That's a really scary word. It can imply that something is very, very wrong and stress them out. And then your internal liaison is in charge of notifying your internal stakeholders of incident conditions, informing the incident commander of any relevant feedback. If you're using incident response software, maybe PagerDuty, this can often be automated, but if you can't, the person in that role should be someone who's aware of the right internal channels to disseminate that information. In either role, the incident commander have to instruct that person to create notification messages, keep those parties updated. They'll be required to craft the message, get approval, and then make sure that that message is going out where it needs to. And then aside from communication, we have just a few things listed here. Customer support can provide all kinds of support to the business itself during the incident. While we're talking about communication today, it's important to know that these colleagues can provide value to your team by aggregating customer-reported issues, for example, to give you a really clear view of how many people are reporting an issue you may not know from your own reporting. They can help you prioritize SLAs. They can play double duty as that internal liaison. We usually recommend splitting those out, but it can happen if possible. And they can provide and support data in post-incident follow-up actions to help understand what happened and how to avoid that next time. So getting into how we do this, it starts with just laying a foundation. The very first step is to make sure that your customer-facing teams have enough information. They should be involved in your incident response, but you also have to treat them as stakeholders so they're equipped. During the incident, internal stakeholder communications are going to proactively provide some situational awareness, some transparency around the customer impact itself. These updates really have to be proactive so no one is caught off guard. And having a well-defined internal process can really benefit your organization in a few ways here. You get more consistent understanding of the current incident across the whole organization, some broader real-time awareness of the impact, and more consistent narratives to share externally. You don't have one person saying something about what's going on the other side of the org, someone else is saying something different. Everyone is aligned. You'll want to include a few key pieces of information in these stakeholder comms internally just to set people up to say the right things. So some of the obvious things, when did this start, or when did we notice it if we don't know that information? Or you can have a really brief description of the services impacted by the incident, whether they're business or technical, depending. You want to talk about what impact it has on customers. If you know that, if you don't, it's okay, just say that. A lot of the time we shy away from saying things when we're unsure, but it's okay to just say, we don't know yet, but we're looking at that piece. Again, this is internal communication, so the stakes are just a little bit lower. Where you're finding information, should they go to a chat channel, a call bridge, something like that? Is there a service status page? You probably have an external one, but if you have an internal one too, call that out. How to respond when someone is asking for more details. That should be information you're figuring out a little early on. And how often to expect updates. When are we going to talk about what's going on here next to an end that isn't distracting to the response itself. You also do need to work consistently with that team outside of the fire drill moment of the incident. There are a few examples here of terms that you should be explaining to your support and other customer-facing teams, especially if you know that they're going to use them in those moments. It's really great too if you have a close relationship with them already. Don't try to start this from scratch. If you don't, you want to start working on it. And let them ask questions. You really want to support building a relationship between your team and theirs. They might ask questions about your tool stack, your infrastructure, terminology that they might not know. And again, let them ask. Sometimes we're a little cagey about information for all kinds of reasons, but if they understand your world, they're going to better understand what is going to happen when that world doesn't function the way you expect it to. So there are a few things that you might want to share. Things like tools and systems that are in use, things that folks in your team or surrounding teams might know, but anyone else might get a little bit lost in. There's no way to guarantee that all of your customers, for example, understand what things like Chef configurations, Nomad clusters, and Kubernetes mean. The internal tools that are built in the naming conventions that come with them become a language that is uniquely spoken only by the people who work at your company. Tools that deliver parts of your services, code names for product launches, that happens pretty often, really creative names for teams or working groups that we think are cute, but outside of context, again, things get a little bit lost. And then freaking acronyms. So this becomes more secret code really, really fast. And these are things that become second nature to your company, even if you think that maybe folks at other companies use these same acronyms, you can't assume that. If you think it's commonplace, it's like, if you know, but you don't want to make it so you have to know. Just make it obvious and clear. And even if you have some process in place with teams, but you haven't shared this detail, it's truly a better late than never strategy to start right now. So the next thing you'll want to do is make sure the team has the tools they need to get that job done when communicating. Tool number one in the communications toolkit is, where do they get information? It's really crucial they know where to get info in these moments. You have to have a channel of information established. So for example, at PagerDuty, there are multiple ways that our support team gets information. The classic Jira tickets, through PagerDuty itself, integrated with their ticketing apps, and through Slack channels where information is readily available when something is going down. Tools and channels have to be figured out pretty early for this to work. So this is priority number one. And then what's the process? They need to know their role in incident response. It could be small, it could be a little larger, it just depends on your org and your needs. So for a lot of these teams, this falls into that customer liaison or communications role, but you need to have some clearly defined roles for them and a description. If you need inspiration, we have a bunch of response guides up that help guide you through this, but before you decide to communicate an incident, it's important to have a really agreed upon set of criteria for how that communication happens. False alarms and short-lived issues can sometimes kick off incident calls. So knowing when communication is appropriate is going to help your customers avoid widespread panic, and you can tie that to your organization's definition of what an incident is and or your severity levels. You might consider the following criteria too. What products are affected? How badly is it affected? How many customers are affected? How noticeable is the impact? Is it something a customer might want to have contingencies for? These are all standard things that your customer-facing teams will have to be ready to pay attention to in terms of how things are progressing, and then to have a plan for those updates. And speaking of which, I cannot recommend templates enough to avoid that you're missing important pieces of information in those comms. You are going to have things that are standardized, and so if you take a few minutes to make sure that you have a few plug-and-play templates in place for these folks at the beginning, they don't have to think of it from scratch every single time. So now that we've done that, it's time to start thinking about how we break it down for customers. The last thing you want is for that team to have to try and draft communication in the moment without a plan for this, or for your team to be asked to draft communication because they have no idea where to go with it. You want to start fresh. Have that liaison in the incident call, have them listening to what's happening, and when it's appropriate, they can then draft their understanding of the issue and ask for a review. In that communication, they should be thinking about customer perspective. If an internal system, for example, is being referred to, They should be able to identify what that maps to in the customer experience, and you can also equip them to do this, again, ahead of time. Maybe you have a system map that they can refer to so they know which pieces of your system map to the customer experience itself. If you have one that's maybe a little bit too much of a deep dive for this purpose, you might want to think of a more simplified one for those teams, for those quick translation moments. And then terminology is the very last piece of crafting decent communication in this moment. Things that they'll want to keep in mind and that you can help them keep in mind when reviewing is keeping the terms basic. If there isn't clear terminology, you should be describing, again, what is impacted in the product itself, what is your user actually going to see, how is it going to break their experience. And if they're not sure, they should feel empowered to ask the incident commander or a subject matter expert on the call, someone who knows for sure. Defining terms for clarity and communication. If maybe you throw out the word infrastructure and you really mean a particular server, just say that instead of the word or the parentheses to define specificity. Keeping it short and sweet, too. Too much verbiage is going to kind of help folks tune out a little bit too fast, so keep it to essential information only. Set their expectations, again, how often are we going to update, what are we actually doing, do we have an expectation around how this is going to be resolved? And then updating too with meaningful context, making sure that you're not just shipping an update out to say, yeah, we're still working on it, we don't know, but that you actually have some information to impart. So once that's laid out, it's time to actually do the thing to communicate. A high here is that you don't have to have them do this for the first time ever in the moment during the incident. That is actually not necessary. If you run game days or failure Fridays, incident simulations, whatever you call it, to prepare for incident response, you can include that team and include the communications process for a dry run before the real thing ever happens. Practice really does make perfect, and that applies to this piece as well. So just a template of good communication during an incident. That first communication should be indicating that an incident is under investigation. The goal here is to avoid your users experiencing symptoms of the incident, checking your status page, checking your social media, and not seeing awareness of the issue from the business. That decision and posting has to happen fast, within 5 minutes of kicking off the incident call. These messages, that's where you really want to use those templates for ease of action. You're mostly just communicating that you know something is going on. You don't have to have meaningful information about what is going on or what you're doing right now, so that template can just be to acknowledge that, hey, something is happening. Minimal in scope, but it should indicate that you're bringing that scope soon. So that second communication should also come pretty fast. Within 5 minutes of the first communication is what we recommend once some scope of impact is known. And that should outline a few more things that you probably know by now after digging in for a couple of minutes. Things like customer impact, which components or functionality are impacted, if regions apply here. Do you know which ones are impacted? Is it all of them or just a few? And then depending on the length of your incident, you're going to have to push out some periodic updates. Every 20 minutes from the scoping update is a good recommendation to start with during the first 2 hours or so of the incident. And after those 2 hours, you might choose to update with reduced frequency. You may even bring in a long-standing incident communication model if you know this is going to keep going for a while at that point. Regardless of expected frequency, when the degree of impact is meaningfully changing, updates should be posted. They should, again, indicate any change in impact or scope, indicate if you think you may have shifted into recovery or mitigation, provide expectations, when are updates going to be posted, and you should also consider that there are going to be a few customers who may have, for example, special contracts. Maybe they have worked with your success or support teams for a premium support plan or something of that nature, where they have expectations around how you're going to communicate as a business when something happens that are a little bit above just what's happening on the status page. They may need to get communication of impact delivered individually, whether it's through, again, that liaison and their account team, so just be aware that you may be asked for help providing context to those updates. I mentioned long incidents a moment ago, so anything a little bit longer than 2 hours is where you should start considering that, hey, this may be a long-running incident, and you'll have some different communication procedures as a result. When we know an incident is going to be extended, you have to set your customer expectations appropriately, and customer notification fatigue due to contentless updates should be avoided. When in doubt, just make sure you're notifying at the frequency, which keeps those updates, again, meaningful. You can't also determine that it's going to be a long-running incident within the first hour, for example. So for incidents where you do know that you have a long-running recovery, just indicate that in an update when you do know it. It might be at that 2-hour mark, it might be just a little bit past. And if you're planning to reduce that frequency, keep providing expectations of when the next update is going to be posted. When you get to recovery, there's finally a light at the end of the tunnel. That's when your final communication in the moment of the incident is going to go out. You're going to have to make sure that that team knows to wait for the incident commander to confirm that you're actually at recovery, not that you're just talking about or you think you might be close. But that update, when you know for sure, can include some confirmation of full recovery. Make it very, very clear to your user that you are recovered. Don't leave it ambiguous. Any clear indication about data loss or lingering corruption or anything of that nature that they may see. And if there are no lingering impacts, clearly note this in an update. Then that liaison is going to get to close out the status page item. They can get ready for a few follow-up steps. And most importantly, this is probably the biggest takeaway, I think, of the whole moment, get some rest. Remember to breathe. You really do want to make sure, especially if you had one of those long-running incidents, that that person takes a breather. It can be really stressful to field all of those communication requests across the org in a moment, because not only are they in the incident call trying to draft those status page updates, but they're getting requests from sales, from your customer success, from their peers on the support team, if that's who's filling this role. And it is exhausting to constantly be that fountain of knowledge for what's going on or how to communicate. So make sure they do take a beat, and even if they have more follow-up tests to do, if they're getting ready for the incident review, that they just take that moment to kind of get back into what's happening. So this has really been just covering how to start. Once you have these steps in place, you can go a little bit further in maturity too. You can develop templates for that customer liaison team when they're writing those status updates for customers, like I mentioned earlier. Both in their own ticketing systems, you can work with them on what that looks like, and in your status tool. Those templates should definitely be available for common issues. I have some recommendations too if you need them on where to start, so feel free to find me later if that's something you're thinking about. Also, regular hygiene check-ins. How is that process working? What isn't? This goes hand in hand with having that team participate in things like incident reviews or postmortems. It's really important to communicate what worked and didn't with customer comms as much as the technical detail of the incident. I mentioned game day practice earlier, and that's a really great time too to check in and update those processes for hygiene purposes. So make sure that they're also part of that. And then you can also consider formalizing the role a little bit. Whether it's a percentage of maybe someone's role, or if it's a separate role under your org, the percentage thing can be hard to figure out. I've talked to a lot of support leaders who are just like, I don't know how that works and how we make it make sense. But bringing those folks into maybe an on-call rotation, for example, having a sense of the incident rate, things like that, will help there. If you have a tool like PagerDuty, obviously it can help you collect this data, but you can get this information from so many different sources. This can even be an option for career development, something they can grow into, or a role from which they can grow into something else they're pursuing. You do have to be creative about this, and most importantly, your support leaders have to be creative about this, but it's really worth working with them to figure out what's right for your org and what's possible with both teams. And then a couple of things that I didn't mention too in that incident review, I realized that I want to just talk through. You want to make sure that they're also talking about not just what worked and didn't work. Were there things that happened, like, for example, an executive coming in, trying to dictate communication? Was there information they needed that wasn't available at a critical moment? Was there maybe someone in another team who worked particularly well and deserves a shout out? Those things are all important to consider in that iteration process too. So again, my LinkedIn QR code is there. I mentioned our response docs. That's at that URL, response.pagerduty.com, where I'd recommend if you're trying to kind of just get into some of these concepts, or if you have some of them implemented and you just want to refine a little bit, that you jump into those spaces. And then two, if you want to connect with other folks using PagerDuty, or other folks just thinking about incident response or any of these processes, My team maintains our community forums, which are called PagerDuty Commons. The QR code there is the sign up. So if you're thinking about these things, if you want to bounce ideas off of other folks, that's what we're trying to encourage in that space. There are kind of a lot of buzzwords on this slide, so let's set this aside for a moment. But that's really what we're looking to do, to just foster some community across folks who we know are all thinking about these same things, both our users and folks who are not, and make sure that everyone is able to just connect there and figure out how to make these things easier, because it's a moment where it's high stress, just naturally, and we should be able to reduce a little bit of the adrenaline rush around that if we have the right process implemented. That's all I have, so thank you so much. I think we have a few minutes if there are questions. Yes.
Questions? Did I see a hand? All right. Well, then I think we're good.
We'll call it, yeah.
Thank you so much, Kat.
Thank you.